everybody, I'm Alex,
And I'm Lewis.
and this is the Rest Is Warhammer. It's our brand new show, maybe ripping off somebody else's IP slightly, but we're going today talking about Warhammer. It's 40k oriented at the moment, and that's because we're talking about the warp. What is the warp? How does it interact with the 40k universe? Lewis, I think we've been doing a little bit of research, and I think it's quite important, isn't it?
Yep, I think it's rather critical to the function of our favourite good guys, the Imperium, because they are definitely good guys. So yeah, looking forward to talking to you, Alex. This is going to be good fun.
So we're going to be splitting it down really into 3 segments. We're going to go over it initially, what is the warp? You'll have all heard of it, but maybe not fully understand what it is. We're going to go into a little bit of how it interacted with the ancient races, how it came about. And then we're going to talk potentially the meat of the episode about the Chaos Gods and how they are involved with the warp and how they evolve from the warp to the real universe.
Indeed, exciting stuff.
Yeah, first question, Lewis. What is the warp?
What is the warp indeed? So I think many scholars of the Imperium have spent a long time trying to get to the bottom of this question, but luckily I have read the Warhammer 40k rulebook and I am fully au fait with what the warp is. So lots of people will know, I think, from just kind of passive knowledge of the game, that the warp is this kind of strange dimension. It's this kind of strange sort of other world, separate dimension, just made up of just like almost like boundless energy. It has a few different names in the Imperium. So they call it the Empyrean, the Immaterium, the Sea of Souls. So it's got a few different names. But fundamentally, it's a place where every thought, every dream, ambition, emotion, fear of all these sentient creatures across the galaxy, it's a place where all of that sort of coalesces in one place and finds like a physical manifestation. It's in an alternate dimension, but it's some kind of physical
bit, isn't it? Where it's metaphysical. This isn't solid rocks, planets with nice Euclidean physics. It's a bit whiffy waffy, anything goes.
Yeah, timey-wimey stuff sort of thing. And it's sort of like every human thought has an echo in the warp. So again, it doesn't, as you say, it's not Euclidean. It doesn't match. It's not like a mirror to the real world, but it's sort of like a distorted echo. And it's the sort of thing where I think if you actually try and look at it, which obviously sometimes happens when you're traveling through the warp and it all goes a bit Pete-tong and stuff goes wrong in your Jello field on your spaceship, you just go completely mad just trying to look at it and understand it. So I think when we're talking about the warp, it's often most kind of described to people as like an ocean, like a sort of endless sea that's constantly in motion.
Energies, plasmas, everything flows into one another. You've got your little eddy currents. And I think it's that ocean is a really good metaphor for something that you can feel around you, but that you can't grab a hold of.
Yeah, and you can't really control it. And similar to oceans on Earth today, it has storms, it has sort of dangerous tempests, there's currents, there's all sorts of kind of movement going on all the time. And that's the sort of stuff which can sometimes make the warp interact with the real world.
That's the thing, it is next to, alongside, one influences the other all the time, doesn't it? Like, we're not just 2 separate universes here.
Yeah, exactly. And it's kind of those places where it interacts with the real world. I think that's where some of the greatest benefits, but also the greatest risks come from human interaction with the warp. Obviously, there's some creatures which we'll come onto in a bit, Alex, when we come on to the kind of ancient side of things, that might be able to find ways of controlling it or interacting with it in a slightly safer way. But
potentially safer,
yeah, kind of. But from the perspective of the Imperium of Man, obviously they have to rely on the warp for travel, communication, psychic powers, and I guess fundamentally keeping the Emperor alive. That's
I would
quite
say
useful.
it's all linked, and it's kind of, we're going to talk about psychers here, I think, but realistically, the warp is intrinsic to how humanity functions in the 41st millennium. Without the warp travel, psychers, specifically somebody like the Emperor.
Yeah.
Without those, there would be no galaxy-spanning empire, and would be stuck potentially not even in our solar system, just on Terra.
Yeah, 100%. And I guess it's that sort of that really that great power, if I'm going to quote Spider-Man here, comes with kind of great responsibility, because where it goes wrong, it goes pretty catastrophically wrong. Where we have areas of the galaxy, or where the warp interacts with the real world, or where psychers have made a bit of a boo-boo and the warp makes its way into the real world, it can just ravage entire star systems with just weird, nightmarish phenomena, madnesses, plagues, mutations, all sort of stuff goes completely wrong when the warp starts interacting in ways that you can't control. I guess the greatest example of that really is probably the Great Rift, isn't it? Or maybe the Eye of Terror.
It's a small phenomenon, isn't it? It's not had a massive impact on the lore, nothing like that at all.
No, nothing at all. And if you say any otherwise, Alex, the Inquisition will be visiting your house very shortly. The Great Rift is just a small blip, absolutely fine, not a problem at all. Carrying on as
under control.
Yes, vaguely under control, definitely. You mentioned psychers there, Alex, which I think is a really, really good point, because I mentioned earlier that all your thoughts as a human, you and I, everyone listening to this, has their emotions and their thoughts echoing in the warp.
Everything has a little ripple, doesn't it?
Yeah, so it has a little ripple, and they're sort of sometimes described as like little lights in the ocean when we're talking about how people's souls, which I guess is the kind of coalescing of all of those emotions.
That is, particularly across many races and not just humanity.
100%.
The thought that souls go to a warp adjacent space.
Yeah.
Called them different things, but it's the warp.
100%. And those kind of those soul lights, or the witch lights, or however you want to describe it, they're present whilst the creature is alive. And different sentient creatures have different kind of strengths of light, different sort of illumination in the warp. So we look at, say, the psychers that we mentioned earlier. They shine really brightly in the warp. So their kind of brain or their soul is just like a blazing sort of flame in the warp. But then you look at some of either kind of humans that don't necessarily have particularly strong psychic powers, or the sentient races which don't kind of make use of the warp or have any kind of psychic signature, like the Tau,
which are much less psychically driven as a race.
100%. They're lights in the warp. They're still there. They still register in the warp, but they're a lot kind of smaller. They're a lot dimmer. And fundamentally, like any ocean, full of all sorts of weird and wonderful creatures, less attractive to some of these weird and wonderful creatures that might want to exploit people.
Just like us. Pretty like what's over there.
Yes, 100%. And they kind of coalesce around, especially to the psychic lights, for example, from psychers or members of the Eldari race. They obviously, all of them are inherently psychic individuals, so they register quite brightly. Those kind of entities that live in the warp, which we kind of call demons, really, is one of them. There's demons associated with the Chaos Gods, which we'll come on to later, but also kind of just general warp demons. They're drawn to those lights, as you say, all shiny. They all kind of coalesce around those individuals, which is where the issue occurs, where if a psyker misuses their power or loses control or doesn't know how to control it in the first place, that's where the service they provide to the Imperium, which is vital, as you say, to maintaining that galactic empire, can just completely crash and burn. And we end up in a situation where these individuals open their minds up in a way where a demonic entity or some kind of entity can enter their mind, open up a pathway, and actually release the warp into the physical universe in a place where it really shouldn't be.
And it's like it's a matter-antimatter reaction here. They don't get on at all.
100%.
It doesn't then necessarily also have to be, say, a demon that comes through, or a creature, even just the warp and real space, which is what we call it, interacting, can just have a catastrophic impact as well.
Exactly, because anywhere the warp touches, it's just kind of insanity and endless mutation, kind of nightmare scenarios just kind of spring up from where warp stuff touches real stuff. And obviously that's a situation we'd like to avoid wherever
I
possible.
would prefer my son to be a few million kilometers away, not landing in my face
Yes.
for no reason. Because time and space just dilated or contracted because warps got involved.
Exactly, and it's all gone a bit wrong. So I think
with that, well, you kind of got that. That's how warp travel works, really. If we're going to move on to kind of uses of it, warp travel works because time and space work differently in the warp.
100%. You can kind of cover significant distances in a spaceship in the warp over a time period that would not be physically possible in the real world. So it allows individuals in the Imperium to cover distances in times that mean they can actually then have an impact on an event or a situation or send a message through such vast distances that you need when you're trying to maintain some kind of galactic empire.
Like crossing a solar system to reach what is called our Mandeville point. Generally, what that is the weakest part, the thinnest part of the veil between the physical, the warp, where it's safe enough to transition. That Mandeville point can take weeks to reach from the nearest planetary body, never mind, say, the inner kind of worlds of a system. That time span is so critical to go. It takes weeks to reach the Mandeville point, but it could then be that you take a week and reach other systems.
Yeah, 100%. You can travel thousands of light years in just a few days if it goes well, or a few weeks or whatever, things like that. And it's interesting that the Imperium have developed this technology, and it's kind of the dichotomy at the heart of a lot of the Imperium, isn't it? It's like you're so reliant on this technology that sustains you, but at just the tip of a hat,
it can go wrong so fast, can't it?
Just end you, because like when you think about the way Imperial ships travel through this kind of weird dimension, it's just utter madness. I mean, I don't know who thought of it. I mean, genius in some respects, but complete madness. They create the Geller field, however you pronounce it. I'm rubbish at pronunciation. Which is
seen both, heard both.
Yeah, I'm sure either is valid. And they literally, all that the ship does, it has its kind of warp drive, which allows it to enter the warp. And this Geller field is literally just a bubble of reality that just goes around the outside of the ship.
Yeah.
And then they just launch it into the warp, which is, as we already talked about, is this dimension of complete madness full of demons and nasty stuff that's just out there to end humans.
And we kind of have some very loose maps, don't we, of expected outcomes if you go in at this speed on this bearing. Well, like if you were just on a sailcraft in the ocean, it might go right if everything goes well. However, things can go wrong.
Exactly. And actually we use, so similar to plying the oceans back in the day, the Imperium use a very particular type of psyker, type of mutant to kind of guide ships along these maps, along these routes, along these kind of stable pathways through, stable currents through the ocean. They're called the navigators, and they have their third eye in the middle of their heads, which allows them to shut their kind of real eyes and open their third eye and look at the warp without going completely insane. Which obviously, if any of us, you or I, as I've mentioned before, we all just looked at the warp, that would be it. We would just be gone. No, we just could not compute. But navigators can look at that and they can read the tides. So they can look at the currents, they can look at the tides, and they can follow them through these predetermined mapped routes. And again, who did the mapping? I mean, this is something that the Imperium at some point in its ancient history has had to kind of discover, is like, how do we find a path that works? How many people had to die? How many ships had to just disappear before they worked out which route works and which route doesn't?
Also, how long can you stay in the warp? Like, the one thing we've not said is the longer the kind of warp hop you're making, the more likely it is you'll have some failure. Some other current will come in and blow you off course.
Yeah.
Be that in space or in time, which if you then go back to at the Space Hulks, oftentimes they're not from the same time period.
Exactly, yeah. And there's been many stories of the the like warp travel causing, say, like a relief force in an army that we've got an Imperial system under attack, and then a relief force is sent from another system, and it arrives before the incident occurs, or it arrives 1,000 years after the incident has finished, and you just think, well, how did that ship has just disappeared in time and reappeared somewhere else, and that is just something that can just happen, and somehow the Imperium, as a bureaucracy, has to just allow for that in its calculations.
Yeah,
Send
there is
enough into
that
one
chance
place
that
that
you
it makes
lose an
it.
entire battle group,
Yeah,
or you get all the Grox meat that you're sending by huge numbers turns up before the Grox lived.
yeah.
And
Explain that
when a
physically.
battle group turns up unexpectedly with weird insignia, the call signs are wrong, you can imagine the consternation that might cause to a system that hasn't discovered the threat it's being saved from.
Yes, it's like in about 500 years, there's going to be a problem here.
Yes.
Which is always interesting when that sort of stuff happens, because you're just like, how do you maintain an empire that just you can't guarantee point A equals is going to reach point B?
Yeah.
And I think there's some of the, before we go on to the ancient stuff, I think some of the current races, the newer races like the Tau, are starting to experiment with it as well, aren't they? They've got what I can't remember, they're called the Star Tide.
Yeah, there's the Star Tie program.
Yeah, something like that. They've got a little mini warp drive they're putting into the Tau spaceships that allow them to do little short jumps. But obviously, the Tau don't have navigators. They don't have a psyche element to their race that allows them to kind of see these currents in the warp or navigate. So they're kind of doing these blind jumps into the warp, but can be very short ones. They're just speeding them up slightly, which obviously is a help. But as the Tau Empire expands, they're going to need to find ways of traveling large distances.
Their drives might be faster in the real world, but it's still nothing like fast enough for system to system travel.
No, 100%. Not consistently anyway. And there's other races that have found weird and wonderful ways around it. So the Tyranids, obviously, they do something with the gravity of the worlds that they're in, don't they? They
Yeah, and they are
slingshot
themselves linked to the warp through their synapse creatures and the hive mind in a way that is entirely misunderstood. Nobody really knows how it works, where they came from, and why they've ended up in this galaxy. And it begs the question then of, is the warp just in this galaxy?
Yeah.
Is it universal?
Yeah, who knows? We shall see, I guess, as the story progresses.
Yeah.
If the Tyranids eat everything, we have to go somewhere else, aren't we, to play our games? So, but you've been looking into some of the ancient.
Yeah, so I think with this races. History, like the warp is not a new thing. So as far as anything that we know, the warp has been around since the universe existed. As we were aware, every being, almost every being, there are exceptions, but leaves an impression. And at the time, we're going to go right back now to the old ones. That very classic kind of image from GW, the guys that made everything.
Yeah.
So we're going to go back, and then we're going to go back behind them as well to the beings called the Catan. So these Necron Catan don't interact with the warp at all. They're a sentient being with no interaction, and of course the old ones had a war with the Necrontyr, and we might go into that at another time if you guys ask for it. But the Necrontyr, the old ones, had a big war, and the Necrontyr got beaten back to pretty much to their homeworld, and Mephet Ran, the Deceiver, the named Catan that we have heard of, struck a deal where they would aid the Necrons. And so we go this way, and now we have these two galactic things, and the warp gets to be in a turmoil. Now, the old ones didn't use the warp in the way the Imperium uses it. They had a significantly safer way of navigating between warp gates called the webway. This webway is what allows them to travel safely and fastly. It's like a sub-realm in the realm of chaos. The Necrons also used this through puncturing little holes in it via their dolmen gates, and that is what allowed them in the War of Heaven to move around safely as well. But the Necrons also had a use of blackstone. Now, this blackstone they discovered could attenuate the warp, make it raging currents, or could becalm the warp. Now, that's part of their use in their dolmen gates. And so going from here, you've now got this material which is important. And we're going to jump again from these dolmen gates.
Just on the war between the Necrontyr and the old ones, this is obviously where some of the Eldari races enter the story, because the old ones effectively started creating races, didn't they? They're creating the Eldari.
Sorry guys, I'm a bit rambly. I'm going to jump around.
No, that's
keep me on track, guys. So yes, the old ones then having been winning, the Necrons, as they are now known, having gone through their biotransference, pushed back, and the old ones having created a bunch of races now go, we need war races.
Yeah.
We need more of them. So they create things like the Krork, which become the Orcs.
Yeah.
And say the Eldari, the Drakero, and potentially cultivate also humanity.
Yeah.
Now, the old ones, of course, lose. We are aware of that. But their races, the Necrons, have been beaten up so much. They're the new warlike races of the old ones, force the Necrons into their hiding.
Yeah.
But they inherit a broken system.
The webway's broken. The fundamental physical planets are in a right mess as well, aren't they? So it's interesting that, because the old ones clearly they knew the dangers of the warp, so they knew they needed to create the webway. They needed to create a method by which their armies could move around. Yet they created the Eldari to help fight that war, which obviously they lost, as you say. They lost that war, so it didn't help. But then
they created a more psychically attuned set of races at this point.
They created psychic races, but they knew how dangerous the warp was.
But I think that's the thing, isn't it? You have this existential threat. You don't want to fall over, go limp.
Yeah.
But that caused all these little eddies that had been rumbling away. If you add more and more energy to them,
yeah,
they cause something more than just a current. They can all coalesce, form together to make something like a warp storm.
Yeah.
And again, you'll have heard the warp storms. It's when there is so much energy in a concentrated place, it can pierce through.
Yeah.
From the warp to real space. So,
and you've got
these can be natural, but they can also, like we heard, these psychers, the psychic souls, can also create enough energy, create these eddies that they bring a warp storm to themselves.
Yeah.
And I think this is probably a good point to start talking about the Chaos Gods.
Yeah.
The Eldari have a special link to one of these.
They have got their own one. Would you like me to? I've done a little bit of looking into how the first Chaos Gods started to form as kind of physical beings, which I think is actually quite interesting, because this is something I didn't know before I was looking into this episode. And it comes back to what you were saying about those kind of those eddies, those little tides of energy within the warp that all got riled up as the old ones started making these psychic races, and they started having emotions. God forbid we should have emotions.
And as well, it's the more powerful, the more stronger the emotion, the stronger the eddy is formed, and it has its own kind of distinct flavour.
Yes, and those similar flavours, those similar thoughts, those similar emotions, over time started to gather together. Initially into currents or tides, and they kind of formed this kind of current as it flowed through of similar energy. So like that kind of matching. So you might have like anguish as a emotion that flowed together into one place, desire place, anger, and such was the energy that those tides were able to put together, and those currents were able to kind of gather in one place. They actually started to form sentient creatures of their own. Now, these are creatures that are made of those similar types of energy. So anger, for example, we can link Khorne to that quite happily. And those creatures that become made of just the very stuff of dreams and nightmares and emotions are what we now call the Chaos Gods. And they started as very rudimentary consciousnesses, and as those sentient races expanded, and as you say, Alex, as they got more energy and more powerful psychers, and even just kind of more individuals, their power started to grow because this energy of similar form just flowed in and flowed in and flowed in, and those sentient beings
likes attract, as it were, right?
Yeah, exactly. And this kind of nurtured their power. And eventually we get to a point where the Chaos Gods become fully sentient, and are able to start reaching back into the real world.
And even before that, they're able to shape the flow of chaos as well. So like,
Yes.
the chaos isn't this formless thing anymore. You have realms that can be created.
Yeah.
So these somewhat more stable, more physical manifestations inside the warp still can be created by such powerful beings on such strong and base emotions, really, isn't it?
100%. And I think maybe one of the easiest ways to kind of visualize that in your mind, if we stick with our ocean analogy for the warp, they're almost like they're able to create sort of islands in the warp. Now, again, they're not physical things. It's not like land and sea, but just think of that in your mind. If you think it as a big ocean, you've then got this
like
island,
waterized, right? So it's sometimes there, sometimes not, but it is all packed together.
Yes. And as we all know, there's the four main gods, and they each have their own little kind of territory, their little islands in the warp. But there are little sub-realms as well. So not something we're really going to touch on today, but our newest friend in the 40k lore progression is our good friend Vashtor, the Archifane himself. He has his little soul forges, which are another little sub-realm. He's clearly been powerful enough to put together a little realm in the warp that stays kind of relatively stable compared to everything around it, and allows him to do his little shenanigans that he's getting up to.
You've got things like the formless waste as well, which are still chaos linked, but aren't necessarily to the main gods.
Yes, exactly.
Well. So this is another realm, another island, but potentially deeper into the warp, where Vashtor's might be, say, on the edge of a warp gate, which has an interaction between physical and immaterial, and what's something that we know can be crossed. But let's tell us, how do these gods gain enough power to cross this realm?
So they grow in power. So these gods grow in power through the emotions that come at them from the real world. So it's in their interest to be able to increase their own power and make their way across the warp, or have influence in the real world, to enhance the emotions that favor them in real space, because that has the reflection in the warp, and those similar tides of energy coalesce on those individual entities. And so I guess one way that they sort of influence that and reach out into the real world is through the kind of, they'll find individuals or influence individuals who've got particular strength or particular passion or particular emotions, and pass out their blessings into the real world. And these blessings, they're not kind of metaphysical things. These are, when they're interacting with the real world, they are immediate. They are real blessings. They might be supernatural powers. They could be extreme longevity.
There's the potential that the Psyker gene
has
the potential to have been a chaos gift.
100%. And there's individuals obviously that are actively courting these blessings and think they can control them, or think they're a route to a better power or better life, or things like that.
If you're a disgruntled kind of citizen, you might be interested in improving your lot than your 17-hour shift in the depths of the hive world.
Yes, something like that. I haven't just come from a 12-hour shift myself, and I have been asking for some blessings. But no, those blessings can go in ways that you're not expecting, and they're not exactly subtle. Some of them, which is interesting for the gods to give that sort of stuff out, and it feels like they're just playing with us, which is interesting.
And what it ends up being is, say, that route where they becomes so much concentrated power, so much concentrated emotion that the Chaos Gods are able to manifest what we have called a demon.
Yeah.
Now, these demons are not permanent. They require a replenishing source of energy, so emotion, typically strong emotions, to keep going. So, understandably, chaos and tumultuous times follow when a demon appears.
Yeah, 100%. And we've got to think as well, these in the warp, there's not just a couple of demons running around. There's untold millions, billions, trillions of them, isn't there? They've just got loads of them running around. Because I guess one thing to always keep in mind before we dive into each individual god, I suppose, is that all four of the main gods, they're in a pretty constant conflict with each other, aren't they? Okay, you might think
They're all a bit jealous, aren't they?
they're not biggest fans of each other, because I think from what Alex we've been discussing, it can be quite easy to think, well, bloody hell, these things are like insanely powerful. Why have they not just taken over? Because actually, the real world is the
It's
source.
anathema.
Exactly. It's the source of their power. So they can't destroy it because that's how they survive. And also, there's three other gods that they hate almost as much, if not more, than the real world itself. So we're almost just like pawns in this kind of game of the war.
Great game.
The great game, in fact, indeed. There we go. There's some 40k lore for you right there. We are pawns in the great game, Alex, and we should enjoy ourselves.
Shall we figure out who our rulers are? Then I think this is a good time to go into the Chaos Gods.
Let's do it. The gods themselves, shall we?
So
I think we could probably do whole episodes on each individual god quite happily. So we'll probably
let
just
us know if you want that.
We can indeed. Like we've not talked huge amount what this podcast is going to look like. Both of us, we're pretty flexible, pretty open to what people want to see. So I guess the sort of thing where if you've been enjoying the content so far, drop the like, do drop the subscription, and let us know what you like. Really, that's the key, I think. And we just make what people want to hear. So
and we're happy to branch out into any Warhammer.
Indeed,
it doesn't have to be 40k. The title is The Rest Is Warhammer, not The Rest Is Warhammer 40k.
Yeah, we can go anywhere. I did a couple of old world ones. No one watched them. So hopefully people watch on this channel.
Yeah.
But yes, gods. Do you want to start with one, Alex? Who's your favourite?
Oh, I've always had a hankering for Khorne. I think.
Good man. I will.
This is very simple, but not simple. Khorne, of course, anger, bloodletting, but also martial pride and prowess. So all of those emotions bring themselves into the realm of Khorne. So if you are forcing these angry issues, we all know how angry we can get over all these little things, and that goes to the realm of Khorne. Yeah. Now, typically, this is then portrayed. He'll portray his demons as kind of bright red, angry, chopping you up in your face. It's not a subtle power from Khorne. But also, this is also how he portrays himself in his realm of chaos. It's very martialistic. You've got in order for his lesser demons to gain more power, they fight amongst themselves for honor, for glory. And that's kind of how that works. He, of course, sits on his skull throne, the skulls of his vanquished enemies, creating this huge throne for him to reside over his realm.
Exactly, and you raise a really good point there, actually, because you touched on what you said, martial prowess. It's
not just negative emotion.
Not negative emotion. Exactly, that's 100% correct. It's not just anger. It can be bravery, for example, heroic last stand. He loves that sort of thing. So I think it's important that it's every human emotion, good or bad, finds an echo in the warp. And if it's one of the emotions that associate themselves with this god, it helps fuel it. So you might think just thinking happy thoughts is sufficient, but it's not. They can feed
positive them as well.
100%. So I guess from Khorne's perspective, bravery, strength, conquest, that sort of might at arms, that sort of thing, which you wouldn't necessarily associate with purely negative All of those things feed
And
into
of
it.
course, Khorne's followers also have this in them as well. They are more, say, martialistic cult following
Yeah.
than some of the other gods. So there is the potential that they perform better on a battlefield or are from the ranks of soldiers as opposed to hive workers.
Yeah, 100%. And obviously, when we're living in a universe where there is only war, he's having a great time.
Yes, there
No
is
shortage of help.
rumor of him being in the ascendancy at the moment.
Yes, loving his soul juice right now. So, yeah. Should I talk about Nurgle?
I think so.
Let's do it.
Flip side to that in some ways.
Yeah, 100%. Grandfather Nurgle himself. He is a god where everybody knows he is the god of decay, of famine, pestilence, disease, that sort of thing. But I guess you could flip it exactly as we've done with Khorne and say he's also all about the circle of life. So rebirth and life and energy and that sort of kind of side of the natural world or the kind of
Very
world.
cyclical, right?
Exactly. And he's often portrayed as, well, he's called Grandfather Nurgle. He's often portrayed as this kind of large, kind of gelatinous kind of mass with a big cauldron where he's constantly mixing up his newest plague or his newest pestilence. And he kind of values that circle of life. He says to get new life, there needs to be death. And he sees these kind of gifts of plagues and gifts of diseases as kind of, as I say, gifts. He doesn't see them as negative. He sees them positive. So he's kind of, it's a slightly twisted version of what the kind of natural world order is, predator prey relationships, all that sort of stuff. And he's kind of the kind of representation of that. And it's hard to put that in emotional sense. I was struggling a little bit. What kind of emotions feed him? But I think it's
anything to do with being ill, right? You've got
being,
you've got your despair, the hopelessness. You've got the fear of death, which permeates so many cultures.
100%, and it's also the excitement of new life.
Yes,
which is that kind of new life energy.
New life recovery, like he's got Nurgle's garden as well. It's where he cultivates new life alongside all this death, destruction, and general nastiness. Really, isn't it?
No, definitely. Who do you want to do next?
I think we'll go down a little story of the Eldari again and go into Slaanesh. Now, Slaanesh is a newcomer onto the scene in relative tens of thousands of years terms. It's new.
Yeah.
And Slaanesh is, of course, we know it as excess in every form. Now, the Eldari, having had the Necrons disappear on them and go to sleep, were suddenly masters of the galaxy and were nigh on immortal. So when you've got all the time in the world, you generally go start pursuing pleasures. So, and this is the cycle that the Eldar went down of. There was no real conflicts. They had everything was perfect. So they were pursuing the arts, the sexual natures, and generally having a very good time. Unbeknownst to them, these extremely strong emotions were coalescing into the warp as a new being, and that being was Slaanesh. Now, at the height of the Eldari Empire, around M30 in the Imperial calendar, this all came to a head when Slaanesh exploded into being and also causing the Eye of Terror to form. Such was the manifestation of energy that it has broken a 10,000 plus year hole between the warp and the material realm.
It's just spilling out into what was the Eldari homeworld.
Yes. And so all of this energy has come out, and Slaanesh still has a hankering for the Eldari soul over all others. It's the most delectable, the strongest, where as we've gone through, they're all psychers, they're all extremely strong feeling.
Yeah.
So Slaanesh with this excess, with this desire, has kind of shape-shifting demons, sensuous, lithe, generally about kind of speed as well. But there's the negative and the positive sides of these emotions. It's your pride in your work, something that has manifested as a gift to, say, Lucius the Eternal, the Chaos Space Marine. Part of his gift is that the pride that someone takes in slaying him reincarnates him. And there was a lovely Hammer and Bolter episode, I believe, on Warhammer Plus about this. It was a good watch.
Just comes back.
Yeah.
But you say it's they're not all bad emotions, are they? Love, music, generosity, creativity. They're all things that feed Slanesh. And I guess the key with it is that you mentioned excess, but it's kind of like once you pass into obsession,
yes,
that's when you really start feeding Slanesh.
Yeah, and it's the pushing that greed, that desire for
going to that next level.
Yeah, more than just a simple pleasure.
Definitely.
But there is another god that we know of, isn't there, Lewis?
Indeed there is. Let's finish on a high. None of us understand what they're doing, and that's all part of the game, I think. We're on to Tzeentch, or as me and my brother used to call them when we were growing up, Tzenitch.
There's a lot of letters that don't feel necessary.
No, none of those letters go together in a combination. But this is the god of change. And that manifests in many ways. It's the god of sort of trickery, the god of planning, the god of fate, the god of destiny, politics, magic, sorcery. So all of these kind of quite complex interactions where plans meet fate. For example, you plan something and then something fortuitous happens, or you're thinking about making big changes in the political arena and you're feeding into that kind of side of him. But then you've also got the magic side as well, where kind of that sorcerous power really starts to flow into Tzeentch, and Tzeentch has the great plan. Now this is a scheme that this god is enacting, and nobody in the sentient world, in the real world, and probably none of the other chaos gods can comprehend or understand what this plan is, this big scheme. And fundamentally, each of the sub-schemes that are part of it in their individual kind of progress are also sort of unknowable until probably it's been a bit too late and the scheme has happened to you.
Yes.
So Tzeentch is kind of pictured as this kind of creature that is just constantly planning, constantly scheming. It's got fingers in many pies. It's just kind of influencing things quite subtly across the world, or across the galaxy, and just kind of generally trying to push things in their favor as the world kind of progresses forwards. And you don't quite know whether what you're doing is actually aiding Tzeentch or conflicting with Tzeentch.
Yeah, and
actually both those things might be the same.
At the time, hasn't he? He's created the demon Chaos Fate Weaver as well to see the future, because that was the one thing Tzeentch could not see, the future. Right, so he forced one of his demons in, and there's now even more chaos involved because
carnage.
It comes out in riddles and prophecies.
Yeah, 100%.
That kind of transmutable nature is also given to its demons, isn't it? The demons aren't typically the same.
No, they're kind of constantly changing, eyes moving all over the place and making a general nuisance of themselves. And they're all quite intelligent, aren't they? You might describe some of Khorne's legions as quite brutal, quite simplistic organisms, whereas Tzeentch's ones, they're all part of this weird plan, and they've all got little parts to play in it. They're all coming up with their own schemes, their own ideas. They're influencing things themselves, and it's all a bit of a mess.
What if your wall became jelly? Literally.
Bring out the spoons.
Yeah. But I think that probably wraps us up about now. I think we've gone through kind of the warp as an entity, how it interacts with the Imperium, with the galaxy, and some of the major details of the Chaos Gods.
Yeah.
So, guys, Well,
Job well
cool.
done, I
We're
think.
going to be wrapping this one up here. If you want to let us know what you would like to hear from us, would you like, say, Lewis to finish his creating a Space Marine video that he tried making some time ago?
I didn't think you were going to bring that up.
I remembered because I enjoyed watching it.
Yes, we had Kevin from. I've forgotten the bloody show. I can't remember. Carry on. I was trying to relate it to a character, and then I got lots of comments about how I was abusing children, and I stopped.
Yeah. But if you'd like us to continue along that vein, you can let us know in a number of places. You can write a comment on this video. You can join our Discord. We've got over 600 members there now.
Yeah, growing nicely.
And you can also, if you really, really want to help us, we have the YouTube memberships. You can sign up, gain an exclusive channel. There are exclusive videos in there as well. But I think with that, it's time for us to say goodbye.
Goodbye.
Goodbye, everybody.